Hello and welcome back to Talking Europe. Almost a month into the war between Hamas and Israel, the European Union is still struggling to speak with one voice. While Commission President Ursula von der Leyen expresses unconditional support for Israel, some of her own staff have signed a letter criticizing her position, along with employees from other EU institutions. Some EU member states continue to express strong support for Israel, such as the Czech Republic and Hungary, while others worry that such stances may harm the EU's image. Meanwhile, President Macron of France has visited Israel and suggested an international coalition against Hamas. He was not representing the EU when he said that. Austrian and Czech leaders have visited Israel as well. On top of all this, the conflict appears to be spilling over into Europe. A synagogue in Berlin was targeted by Molotov cocktails, and anti-Semitic inscriptions have been reported in Spain and the UK. To discuss all of this, I'm joined by Mark Botenga, a Belgian MEP from the Left Group. Welcome to you, Mark.
Thank you very much.
Also very pleased to be hosting Thijs Ruiten, a Dutch MEP from the Socialists and Democrats, who stepped in at the last minute to be on this programme. Thank you, Thijs. You've spoken about diplomatic amateurism at the European Commission. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean that in the first days in particular, we saw so many different messages, including Commissioner Vahely saying that we had to stop all aid, and then it was revoked again. But also the, in my view, very disappointing display of Commission President von der Leyen and the President of our Parliament. They were in Israel in the first days, and they did not succeed in expressing the same compassion with victims that were already then subject to the heavy bombing in Gaza. I mean, no doubt, the condemnation also from me of the horrendous terrorist attacks. But at the end of the day, a baby dies in Israel and a baby dies in Gaza.
Yeah, I suppose they would have argued, as the Israeli leadership does, that it was Hamas that started this particular cycle.
Of course. But already then, and now, after 2 weeks, more than 2 weeks into the war, finally, Commission President shared compassion with all the victims, 700 plus children also having died under the Israeli bombing of Gaza. And I think that is not balanced, and it doesn't help us further ahead, because what we should do, and the priorities are, to me, very clear. These hostages have to be released, there has to be a ceasefire, and we have to get the peace process relaunched.
What do you think about the EU's messaging, first of all, Mark Botenga?
Well, it's a complete scandal. I mean, when you go to Israel, as Commission Chairwoman von der Leyen has done, and you don't have a mandate, because let's make it very, very clear, it's the Council determining EU foreign policy. It's not the Commission. You go over there, you promise unconditional support at the moment at which Israel announces the forced displacement of 1.1 million Palestinians in Gaza, because it was the same day. So Israel say 1.1 million Palestinians need to leave their home, right? Which is a war crime. If forced displacement is a war crime, and at that moment you cannot tell the very basic thing of say Israel should respect international law and international humanitarian law, which applies to all countries, and which is a position of the European Union. And Borrell, let's say the EU foreign minister and the high representative, he said it very clearly. He was very clear in his rebuttal of von der Leyen's statements. So this was an absolute scandal, and the question is, has she encouraged this Israeli attack on Gaza?
Well, when you mention war crimes, though, one also has to say that not only Israel, but other entities have pointed to Hamas using the civilian population to essentially as human shields. So how would you hold Hamas accountable for that at the same time?
Let's be clear. I mean, all war crimes need to be punished. There's no question. The thing is of human shields, if you look at Gaza, Gaza is a very, very small area. It's very highly populated. And once you start shaving off complete residential areas, when you start bombing bakeries, was Hamas hiding in bakeries? Supermarkets, was Hamas hiding in supermarkets? It's an excuse, of course. I mean, I'm not saying no, they never do it, but it's an excuse, of course, to justify attacks on civilians, which are illegal. And take this example. The European Union never said that the Ukrainians, when Russia bombed schools or residential areas in Ukraine, European Union said these are war crimes, these should be punished, and rightly so. This is an international law principle, right? They were not saying the Ukrainians are using these schools as human shields, you know? I've got no problem whatsoever in condemning war crimes by Hamas, but the European Union here should do the same towards Israel.
Let's maybe move on to what you mentioned, Thijs, about let's try and move forward, essentially. What should the political agenda be now, and the 3 points that you said, and does the EU have any power to actually affect any of these things?
Well, let's first also establish that, regrettably, the European Union, in, let's say, the past decade, has been very absent from the peace process. We have basically looked too long the other way. We had the Abraham Accords, and everybody thought, oh, well, maybe there is a chance to bring things forward. But basically, we left it to the former President of the United States, Donald Trump. And that is a big problem, and we do not seem to understand that now is the time for the EU to be united in the things we've discussed, but also to take a position in relaunching the peace process. Because let's be clear, this war on terror, like seems to be launched now by Israel, we've learned, I hope, from the past that this is very, very difficult to find and to perpetrate the perpetrators of these terrorist crimes. We need to get back on the table to find a road to peace, to lasting peace that will bring security to both Israel and the Palestinians.
But I suppose who represents the EU in any new peace initiative? Because now we've seen Europe having so many different voices. Von der Leyen, not the same as Charles Michel, not the same as the member states. So how could the EU actually put forward a proposal as the EU for peace?
I think it's very clear. This is, you know, organized at the EU level. We shouldn't improvise. It's not because Ms. von der Leyen at some point decides that she represents foreign policy of the EU that this is the case. It's not the case. It's very clear. It's the Council and its High Representative.
Borrell, yeah.
So there's no discussion about this. We need to respect this. And the EU has leverage. You know, the EU should ask for an immediate ceasefire, and we have leverage. There's an association agreement with Israel, right? It is clear in this association agreement that Israel should respect human rights. We see today that they're not doing it. Amnesty International is saying it, Human Rights Watch is saying, the United Nations, the World Health Organization, very clearly, let's demand the basic respect for human rights from Israel. And we have the leverage over Israel to say, okay, if you do not, then there will be sanctions, like we put sanctions on Russia when they attack civilian infrastructure.
I'd like to have both of your thoughts on this question I mentioned in my introduction about possible spillover into Europe. And there was a survey, Thijs Rutten, in the Netherlands for Eén Vandaag, the program on the First TV channel, which surveyed 30,000 people, I was reading, and a clear majority of them said that these tensions in the Middle East, they thought would make people more unsafe in the Netherlands. That must be a pretty big concern.
Well, it is concerning, but I think that's also a job for our leaders, for our prime ministers, for our the people also having responsibility to state clearly that this is not a war of religions. This is not a war that we are going to want to have also in our societies. We need to stand together in our societies on the side of human rights, on the side of preventing human suffering. So there's absolutely no room there for anti-Semitism, but also not for increased discrimination of Muslim citizens, for example, in the Netherlands. That's absolutely unacceptable.
So what do you think the policy should actually be?
Well, people like our Prime Minister, our government in the Netherlands, but also all other governments in the European member states should be very clear that this is not a conflict on our soil.
Mark Wittenga, so in Belgium there's a substantial Muslim and Jewish population. Are you concerned about what might happen here in this country?
Well, I think, a rise in anti-Semitism or other forms of racism is a big risk in general. I mean, doesn't date from today.
Yeah.
And I think that's why, and I agree, we need to insist this is not a religious conflict. This is a conflict linked to decades of colonialism, of occupation. And if you look at, I mean, Palestinian Christians, for example, in Jerusalem, you know, they're also victims of these forms of ethnic cleansing where they're losing their houses. And if you look at the demonstration we had in Brussels, you know, 40,000 people demonstrating solidarity with the Palestinians in Gaza, there were progressive Jewish organizations present, mobilizing. And so this is really, really important because we cannot tolerate in any way that there would be anti-Semitism, racism, Islamophobia. This is not the case. This is a conflict between a colonial occupier and a people that are you know, occupied and colonialized for ages. And we need a solution for that. We need a just peace there.
But okay, support for the Palestinians, obviously that's one thing. If somebody is shouting pro-Hamas slogans and Hamas is considered to be a terrorist organization in the European Union, should they be prosecuted then clearly for that?
Well, there's laws on the national level. All countries have laws against hatred or against racism, against Islamophobia, against anti-Semitism. Against incitations on violence as well. You know, you cannot call for violence. So that's something that the national courts will deal with. What I do think is very worrying is the tendency to ban demonstrations altogether, like we've seen in France, like we've seen also in Germany. I think this is very, very dangerous democratically. And we've seen in Belgium also a tendency to, you know, extend this. We've had before the conflict here right now, we've had this with trade unionism. You know, where they were saying maybe we need limits to the right to protest also on other causes. And so I think in Europe there's this tendency of restricting protests, which I'm very, very worried about, which is not related just to these events.
We'll have to end it there. Thank you so much for both of your contributions, Thijs Roten and Mark Batenga. And that's all for this edition of Talking Europe. Thanks very much for joining us.